75 years ago today, on October 23rd, 1944, the Gato-class submarines USS Darter and USS Dace discovered a Japanese fleet under the command of Imperial Japanese Navy Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. Their discovery marked the beginning of one of the largest and most interesting naval battles in all of history. There's so many great stories to tell about the epic Battle of Leyte Gulf, but one of the most interesting is one that's kind of forgotten. That's relegated to the arcane discussion of naval strategists, and that's the story of Task Force 34, or why it is that in one of the greatest naval battles in history, some of the greatest battleships ever built never shot at each other. It is history that deserves to be remembered. In October 1944, the Japanese Navy was a shell of its former self. Most notably, its air arm had been devastated in the June Battle of the Philippine Sea, where 3 fleet carriers had been sunk and over 600 aircraft lost. Japan was more and more forced to deploy pilots with insufficient training, a fact that showed in early October in the devastating Formosa Air Battle, where another 500 planes were lost. On October 20th, the U.S. 6th Army had begun its invasion of the Philippine island of Leyte. The invasion represented a choice. The original plan in the island-hopping campaign was to take the southern Philippine island of Mindanao, but U.S. air operations had concluded that Japanese defenses in the Philippines were degraded, and so Mindanao had been bypassed. Instead, the decision was made to make an attack in the central Philippines. The invasion of Leyte instead of Mindanao moved up the timeline of the campaign, but the choice would also come to haunt the U.S. The U.S. had both the powerful 3rd Fleet under the command of Admiral William Halsey and the 7th Fleet under Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid supporting the Leyte invasion. Given the state of the Japanese air arm and Imperial Japanese Navy, an attack seemed, well, insane. But to the Imperial Japanese Navy there was no real choice. Japan realized the importance of holding the Philippines, which straddled their supply lines to Southeast Asia, critical to their war effort, most notably for their fuel oil. If Leyte were to fall, the remaining ships of the Japanese Navy would essentially have 2 choices. They could go north to the Japanese home islands, but that would cut them off from their fuel supplies in Southeast Asia. Or they could go south to the holdings in Southeast Asia, which would cut them off from their food and ammunition supplies at the home islands. There was no point, the Japanese reasoned, in preserving their fleet if they could not hold the Philippines. The Japanese collected virtually their entire remaining heavy fleet elements and prepared a plan to attack the American fleet, with the goal of destroying the vessels supporting the battle on Leyte. With their air assets in ruins, the desperate attack would depend upon the big guns of the Japanese Imperial Fleet, including the 18-inch guns of the battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever built. The Japanese plan was called Operation Sho-Go. A northern fleet, centered on the carrier Zukaku, Japan's last fleet aircraft carrier and the last of the aircraft carriers that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, would be sent as a decoy. It was hoped the tempting target of the aircraft carriers would draw off much of Halsey's 3rd Fleet. 2 other fleets, a southern fleet coming through the Surigao Strait and a powerful center force, including Yamato and Musashi, coming through the San Bernardino Strait, would converge, wipe aside what American ships were left behind, and attack the transports and supply vessels supporting the troops under General Douglas MacArthur fighting on the island. It was a daring plan and a virtual suicide mission for the ships of the northern decoy fleet. The first sign of battle came on October 23rd, when the Gato-class submarines Darter and Dace detected Japanese vessels on radar. It was the center force, the most powerful of the 3, under the command of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. The fleet included 5 battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 15 destroyers, but no aircraft carriers. Darter and Dace made an attack the next morning that was uncommonly effective, sinking the heavy cruiser Otago and Maya, and so damaging a 3rd heavy cruiser, Takao, that had to withdraw. The submarines avoided attack, but Darter ran aground on a shoal the next day and had to be abandoned. It was a heavy blow. Otago had been Kurita's flagship, but the admiral survived. The Americans now knew where the main strike fleet was and had a good idea of its intentions. With no aircraft carriers to provide air cover, it should have been easy to overwhelm Kurita's group with air attacks by the 3rd Fleet's carrier groups. But the earlier decision to bypass Mindanao now loomed large. The nearest land base for Allied planes was more than 500 miles from Leyte. That stretched Halsey's air assets in many ways. With no ground base nearby, the planes had to be used for scouting, reducing the numbers available for combat. Carl Zingheim, staff historian of the USS Midway Museum, noted in an essay this year that nearly 100 fighters and 58 dive bombers from Halsey's fleet were diverted to reconnaissance roles to locate Japanese forces on the critical day of October 24th. Also, because they were responsible for air cover for the invasion, many of Third Fleet's air elements had to be kept near Japanese air bases around Manila, stretching Halsey's air assets along the entire length of the Philippine archipelago. The broad demands were also wearing out his air assets. 2 of his carrier groups had been dispatched to the rear, to the Caroline Islands, more than 800 miles from the Philippines, to rest and rearm. One was called back when Darter made its first report, but the strongest carrier group of the Third Fleet was allowed to continue rearward. By the time Halsey realized the Japanese intention and called them back, they were too far away to impact the battle. The largest naval battle of the Second World War was materializing, with a major Japanese surface force lacking air cover, and some 40% of Halsey's Third Fleet air assets were not available. The mistake could have had devastating consequences. On October 24th, in a day of scattered attacks, U.S. planes were able to sink the massive battleship Musashi, finally worn down from numerous attacks, and force another heavy cruiser, the Miyoko, to retire. Other ships were hit, including the battleship Yamato, but not crippled. The air arm had failed to do what it should have been able to do: destroy Kurita's force. But what was worse, the reports from the air groups greatly overestimated the amount of damage that was done to Kurita's fleet and misinterpreted a turn that he took to avoid the airplanes. Halsey was convinced that Kurita's fleet was destroyed and retreating. It was a costly misconception. And that is where Task Force 34 comes in. Before Kurita had been engaged, Halsey had established a plan in case the force was to reach the San Bernardino Strait. He ordered the creation of a powerful task group under Vice Admiral Willis Lee. Lee was the correct man for the job. An expert on gunnery, he was a man set aside for the day that the big guns of the American battleships would have to engage the enemy in direct combat. Lee had been in tactical command at the naval battle of Guadalcanal, where USS Washington in South Dakota had sunk the Japanese battleship Kirishima, by some measures the only battleship-on-battleship kill of the Second World War. Task Force 34 was powerful, including 4 fast battleships, the Washington, Alabama, New Jersey, and Iowa, along with 7 cruisers and 19 destroyers. Halsey gave the order that the group be created, and that order was heard by Vice Admiral Kinkaid, commanding the 7th Fleet. But there was a problem. Halsey sent a clarifying order. Task Force 34 was only to be created on his command if he saw a risk in the San Bernardino Strait. Kinkaid's group did not receive the clarification, nor did Halsey's commander, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Ocean Areas, who was at Pearl Harbor. Thus, Kinkaid thought that a group had been assigned to defend the San Bernardino Strait, but that group had not, in fact, been created. Kinkaid took his main fleet elements, including 6 older battleships, to set a trap for the southern Japanese force moving through the Surigao Strait. Then Halsey received the word that the northern fleet, the Japanese aircraft carriers, had been discovered. He immediately gave chase. Thinking that Kurita had been defeated, he took his entire fleet with him. He never gave the order to create Task Force 34. The San Bernardino Strait was undefended. Kurita's group was not, as Halsey surmised, crippled or turned back, and Kinkaid had gone south. As darkness was approaching, Admiral Lee, concerned that Kurita might return, sent a message to Halsey recommending that Task Force 34 be activated. Later, planes from the USS Independence, the only U.S. carrier built for night operations, confirmed that the center force was operating with running lights and appeared to be approaching the San Bernardino Strait. Halsey appeared to shrug off both, convinced that sinking the carriers was the key to crippling any future operations for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Kinkaid laid a trap for the ships of the southern Japanese fleet. A fleet under the command of Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf attacked the force, including 2 older battleships and 4 cruisers under the command of Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, in a night action. The Japanese fleet was largely sunk by torpedoes from destroyers, attacking in the straits where Nishimura's larger ships could not maneuver. But Nishimura's flagship, the battleship Yamashiro, came within range of the battleships of the 7th Fleet, 5 of which had been damaged or sunk at Pearl Harbor. Those battleships were happy to have their 14-inch guns participate in the last battleship-on-battleship action in history. Nishimura's fleet was devastated. But there was a problem. At almost the same time, about 3 a.m., that the Yamashiro was falling under the guns of Oldendorf's battleships, the small fleet supporting the ground forces on Leyte were sighting the masts of Kurita's central force. The IJN's unlikely plan seemed to have worked. Despite their losses, the Leyte invasion fleet was now virtually undefended and at the mercy of a large Japanese fleet that included the largest battleship ever built. As soon as reports about Kurita's fleet came in, Kinkaid started sending messages to Halsey. The first said, Is Task Force 34 guarding San Bernardino Strait? The next said, urgently need fast battleships at Leyte Gulf, at once. Another said, our escort carriers being attacked by 4 battleships, 8 cruisers plus others. Request Lee cover Leyte at top speed. Request fast carriers make immediate strike. And finally, a desperate call. So urgent that it was not encoded. Where is Lee? Send Lee! Lee was not there. Task Force 34 had not been constituted, and its ships were sailing north, far from Kurita and Leyte. Halsey was still convinced that the Japanese carriers were more important. He only detached a task force after a message from his commander, Admiral Nimitz, which also may have been misunderstood. The American fast battleships were detached early enough to miss the action against the Northern Fleet, but too late to arrive at Leyte. During the largest naval battle of the war, some of the best ships of Halsey's fleet were never able to engage. The defense by Taffy 3, the tiny task group that was supporting the invasion on Leyte, is legendary. The tiny group included a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts and tiny escort carriers. They were wildly outmatched by Kurita's fleet, but they put up a tenacious defense. They took terrible losses, but in one of the most enigmatic decisions of the Second World War, Kurita, unaware of the power of the force in front of him, retreated. Had he pressed the attack and been able to attack the invasion fleet, it probably wouldn't have been devastating to the Allies' plans, because at that point the Imperial Japanese Navy was virtually destroyed. But the losses on the transport and support vessels and among the soldiers that were depending upon that support, well, they would have been terrible. Kurita's precipitous retreat saved the United States from what could only be called a disaster. Halsey spent the rest of his career justifying his decisions, arguing that he had gotten Kinkaid's messages too late to do anything about it, and that the aircraft carriers were the more important target. The Japanese Northern Fleet, under the command of Vice Admiral Zizaburo Ozawa, was devastated by Halsey's remaining group. But a couple of ships survived that might also have been sunk had his battleships not been pulled off at the last moment. As a terrifying postscript of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, as Kurita was retreating, the escort carriers of Taffy 3 came under air attack by planes that were being deliberately crashed into the ships. Several ships were damaged, and the Casablanca-class escort carrier St. Lo was sunk. It was the first mass use of the Japanese kamikazes, and the war had moved into another terrible phase. If you're an aficionado of World War II, one of the great tragedies of Task Force 34 is the battle that was never fought. Had Lee's force been defending the San Bernardino Strait, then that would have been a contest between roughly equal-sized fleets, including 4 of America's best battleships against 4 of Japan's best battleships, including the Yamato. Contemporary scholars argue that the better fire control of the American ships meant that it would have been a mismatch. But you have to think that the 18-inch guns of Yamato would have had something to say about that. It's history that never quite happened, and yet deserves to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.